We have an outstanding opening panel. And I think we'll introduce the panelists in reverse order that they'll speak. So first is Chris Nelder. He's the manager of the mobility practice at the Rocky Mountain Institute in Colorado here, and he heads the EV integration team. Chris is the author of 2 books in energy and investing, has written more than 200 articles in publications such as Nature and Scientific America and The Slate. In his spare time, most of us probably know him as the host of the Energy Transition Show. So let's welcome Chris. Thank you. And a fun fact, he's a lifelong musician, formerly trained as a vocalist, but mainly plays the congas and other percussions. So something to talk to Chris about during breaks, if you're into music. Rebecca Johnson, Dr. Rebecca Johnson, is the Transmission Empowering Market Advisor for WAPA. Rebecca joined WAPA in 2015, has over 31 years of experience in finance and business, and she holds a PhD in energy policy and an MS in environmental studies and an MBA. Before you come, I want to say the fun fact here. Early in her career, Rebecca worked for a bank that was robbed by a police officer who fired a gun during the robbery. It was robbed and the police officer fired the gun. But her career has generally been a lot calmer since. And last is Duane Highley. He's the CEO of Tri-State G&T. It's a not-for-profit power supply co-op with 43 members and covers most of, half of Colorado, I'd say, a small portion Nebraska, and a good portion New Mexico and Wyoming, and provides power to over 1.3 million customers. Little fun fact about Duane is he owns a number of saxophones. And once playing while in church, the band leader said, "Mr. Highley, can you please turn that down?" Thinking he was electrically connected. And when the band leader found out he was not, he said, "Duane, could you please turn the other way and have your back to the audience?" So with that, Duane. All right, we're going to kick this off with a series of about 10 or so minute TED Talks. And we'll start with you, Duane.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. You want me to do it from here?
Actually, there's a clicker right there, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, so I'm delighted to be here in front of y'all. It's a fulfillment of a life dream to be here in Boulder, Colorado with so many energy experts that are thinking about how we're going to make a grid transition. And to share the stage with these esteemed colleagues is just a real thrill for me. So thank you for the invitation, Gary, to be here today. I want to talk a little bit about Tri-State. You already heard we have 43 members in a non-for-profit cooperative business model across a number of communities in the West. Our footprint is over 200,000 square miles, larger than the state of California, but with only 1.3 million people. And so that's part of the challenge, is how do you serve such a sparse area with reliable and affordable power. And a third of our energy now is coming from renewable resources, and we're about to expand that in a very big way. So stay tuned. I've been CEO of this organization for just 6 months. I started on April Fool's Day, April 1st. It was the perfect day to start a new job. And since then, we've seen lots of rapid change at Tri-State. Our board has adopted a number of new initiatives. We have a new mission statement, which includes the word responsible for responsible energy, so that's a big shift for us. We have a new contract for our members that gives them more flexibility in how they buy and their ability to develop local renewable projects. A new regulators, one single federal regulator that gives us more consistency as opposed to a patchwork of state regulation, and a new subsidiary that we're developing to offer power supply, both solar and electric vehicle infrastructure for our members. It will be a wholly owned subsidiary of Tri-State. A new RFP for renewables with hundreds of megawatts to be announced before the end of the year that will take our renewable footprint from 30% to 50%. And so stay tuned for that. And then a responsible energy plan. We're working with former Governor Bill Ritter in a convening of stakeholders to develop what our future power supply looks like as we go ahead into the 2030 and beyond. So the big challenges for us, obviously competing legislation. For instance, New Mexico has a 50% RPS, but Colorado has a goal of a statewide 50% carbon reduction. Well, those are slightly different, and compliance gets harder as we look at each state having a different mission. As you can imagine, Wyoming's mission is to continue to burn coal, and so it's interesting to bring those stakeholders to the table, and obviously our co-op members, the 43 members we serve, come to our board table every month, and every one of them writes a check to their local electric cooperative. They're deeply concerned about reliability and affordability, and then they have diverse opinions on what the future grid should look like. So bringing that together is a challenge. There's a concept of stranded debt when we transition away from coal. Obviously a lot of depreciation that's not yet recognized and debt. And is the low cost of new renewables enough to bridge that gap between the stranded cost of coal and what they can provide for us? Because renewables are now coming in well below the variable operating cost of any fossil fuel resource. So I was going to say the 70% solution on this slide because it sounded to me like the 7% solution, which is a Sherlock Holmes novel, right? So talking about how do we get to a cleaner grid, and I just thought it sounded like the 7% solution. And the hook there is it's a mystery novel and no one knows how it's going to turn out. And that's a little bit true about us and how we get to a 70% or 80% clean grid, but I decided to go with 80% because I think that's achievable for us within a reasonable time frame. So how do we do that? Here's the answer. Pretty simple, right? Less coal, more renewables, lots more, and just a little more gas. And I'm sure Gary can tell you about that. That's what his modeling would show. Not a lot more gas, but the stuff we got to add has to be really fast start, fast stop, and start up, shut down multiple times per day. That's what the future grid I think is going to look like until we figure out that 100%. I'm going to stick around for the next panel so I can hear that. I'm eager to hear how that could go. And I'm pushing the wrong button. The laser doesn't get me there. Now, obviously, as we think about the West, and I spent 37 years of my career on the Eastern grid. Nice, tightly integrated, lots of load, heavily loaded transmission. And you come out into the West where everything's far apart, not a lot of load, it's a whole different equation. And we have to know how that's going to work together as we try to integrate massive amounts of more renewables. If we end up having to build lots of new transmission, then that's going to be a big delay for meeting our climate goals. Colorado wants to see a big transition, more than 80% carbon reduction by 2030. That's just 10 years, which is light speed for electric utilities. And if you think about a typical transmission line permitting process, it can go anywhere from 4 years to 15 years. Well, we can't afford to wait 15 years for permitting a transmission line if we've got to make the energy transition in 10. So that's going to be a big challenge for us. And one of the solutions we see is regional markets. So we are trying to advance the cause of regional power purchase markets, real-time markets. We think that will greatly facilitate the integration of massive amounts of renewables into the grid. The broader footprint you can spread that over, the better it will be. My experience with Southwest Power Pool, where I worked for the previous many decades, was that they're now seeing over 70% penetration of wind energy. And just a short story. When I was a new resource planning engineer in the 80s and I was asked to figure out how much wind energy we could integrate into the grid, I did some studies and I said, I got the answer, it's 7%. Anything more than that and we risk breaking the grid. And now I was only off by a factor of 10. So the Southwest Power Pool, by integrating across 14 states, can achieve well over 70%. And people say, well, when do you break the grid? And I answer, I don't know. I talked to the engineers about synchrophasers and phase angles across the footprint, and we know they're getting wider and wider, but it's kind of like we're all collectively as utilities marching toward the cliff blindfolded, and we don't know exactly where the edge is. Now, we hope that California is the one that figures out the edge first. And, but we think regional markets is going to be a big part of that transition. So, since we're having this conference here in the shadow of Long's Peak, I thought I'd share a little mountain climbing story. So that's the backside of the keyhole, and you know what it's like when you get to the top? There's nothing like the mountaintop experience. But as you know, you don't get the mountaintop experience without climbing the mountain. And Martina Navratilova said, what did she say? She said, the moment of victory is far too short to live for that and nothing else. So we've got some pretty bold climate goals ahead of us and energy transition goals. But we have to remember that it's going to be hard work to get there, and it's not just one mountaintop and you make one announcement or a utility says we're going to do this and it's all over. That's just the beginning. And I'll leave you with this. After climbing a great hill, one finds there are many more to climb. In the words of Nelson Mandela. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to answering some questions.
afternoon, everyone. It's good to be here. It's good to be part of this panel. I haven't been to Boulder in a while. I went to school here, so it's good to be back, and it's a beautiful day. So as I start my presentation, I should figure out how to use the clicker. Perfect. Oh, it's fine. Thank you. So Western Area Power Administration, I think we might be one of the most misunderstood electric utilities in the West. So I want to spend just a few minutes talking about what we do. We're a wholesale electricity provider. We sell power from federal hydropower facilities, about 10 gigawatts, 57 different dams. We've got about 17,000 miles of high voltage transmission in the Western Interconnection. We've got about 700 customers that are primarily rural electric associations and municipal electric associations. Tri-State is our biggest customer. So good to see you here, Duane. And then the power marketing administrations exist to sell that federal hydropower. So we have the going into it advantage of all of our energy is carbon free. So that helps us with our positioning and helps us certainly with our customers. Another thing that WAPA does is that we operate 3 balancing authorities in the West. For anybody who isn't familiar with those, balancing authorities are basically control areas. They're responsible for balancing demand and supply in real time. There's not a lot of tolerance of letting those get out of balance, and so there's a lot of responsibility on those BAs. And one of the things that we can say about that is it's really the balancing authorities that help keep the lights on. WAPA has a pretty significant role in national security. We provide energy to military bases. We provide it to the national labs. I'm guessing we have a few people here from NREL. Yeah? Maybe? And then we also participate in industry grid security and grid resilience planning. There is a Grid X periodically. We've got another one coming up, and WAPA is very involved in those. It's the size of our system and the number of states that we cross. Also the fact that we have hydro resources which are exceptionally good at restarting the system in the event of a complete outage. It's referred to as black start, and hydro is probably one of the best assets to do that. So, energy system transition. As we're moving to cleaner generation resources, there are non-trivial implications for the operation of the system. WAPA's balancing authorities see this every day. The changes in the generation change supply and demand. They change the variability in real time for the system operators. These issues are not dismissible. They're surmountable, but they're not dismissible. And so it's always exciting to see a group of people like this together talking about the energy transition, because I feel like these are some opportunities to really dig into the how do we get to where we are now, to where we need to be. And there really are some physical challenges. I'm completely optimistic that we can meet them. Maybe a little bit with Duane on hoping that California finds that edge before the rest of the interconnection does. Significant issues that we want to make sure we get on top of in advance: capacity. We need dispatchable capacity. In the past, that has largely been coal and gas. It can be renewables, but we need to make some changes in how we run those. And then I want to second Duane's position that electricity markets, large operating footprints with liquid markets are, I believe, and the organization that I work for believes, going to be critical to the energy transition. So electricity capacity. 2 aspects to capacity: the ability to generate electricity, and we also need it for reliability because we need to have reserves. Some of the things that we've got going on. Houston, we have a problem. Texas is largely lauded as one of the entities or one of the states that has the highest penetrations of wind. They have done a fantastic job of building out their transmission system, of building out their wind resource. They have a very, very tight reserve margin, and they felt that very acutely this summer. Their system was running very close to the top of their capacity. They had to call emergencies on several different occasions. Their market prices hit the market cap twice in 1 week. Their market cap is $9,000 a megawatt. Typically, a baseline per megawatt is about $20. And so you can imagine what this would do to customers, to regulators, to any consumer of electricity or anybody who's responsible for making sure that that is delivered reliably and economically, this is just a situation that can't persist. And so one of the things that we really need to be working on is the capacity resources. Second one, here we go, California. They're just so easy to pick on. How many people are here from California? Okay, sorry. Maybe I should. No, but I mean, it really is. California's progressive. California's energy policies are really helping the rest of the interconnection, and in fact, the rest of the country, really feel out where that edge is. And the grid operator is looking forward to the next few years and really being vocal that, hey, we need to do some things to make sure that we don't trip off the edge of that cliff. And so very impressed at the way the CAISO is handling that. Because we have so many people here from California, I'm guessing that a number of you have seen this graphic. The CAISO is expecting capacity shortages of about 2,300 as soon as 2020 and up to 4,700 by 2022. You can't run a grid with that, so they need to come up with solutions, and they have some very pragmatic proposals that will be decided on by the policymakers in the state. They want to increase the resource adequacy from operational, mothballed, and new resources. A key component of this is gas generation. It's the quick start, it's the fast ramp. We saw the duck curve from a few years ago. That type of ramp that occurs in the afternoon, I'm speaking to the choir, you guys know this already, but the CAISO is really working very actively to make sure that they're managing this as the renewable penetrations in the state continue to increase. Moving north, the Northwest is interesting because they're actually a winter peaking system. A group of entities in the Northwest got together and they've done some evaluations of their resource adequacy over the next decade, looking at the retirements across the footprint and how quickly they are bringing generation on, what they perceive to be some of the risks associated with the hydro generation. There's obviously a lot of that in the Northwest. Their conclusion is that by next year, they could start to run into capacity shortages, and by the mid-2020s, they could be thousands of megawatts short. And so that region is also being proactive in looking at what they need to be doing now to bolster their systems so that they don't run into reliability or market economic issues because of the shortages in capacity. As Duane mentioned, it takes a very long time to build transmission, and so that isn't necessarily a solution to what we're looking at for capacity right now. It's generation resources that we're looking to. One of the things that the Northwest entities referenced in part of their report is they compared where they are to the California energy crisis of the early 2000s. That's really not such a stretch. When we're starting to see wholesale market prices pushing at 9,000, when we're starting to see utilities that are running out of capacity during peak demands, that's definitely something that needs to be catching our attention, and it is. Again, that's one of the reasons I'm so glad to see this group of people here today working on tackling these tough issues. So we have a risk, we have the capability to deal with it. One of the points I want to make, failure in the energy transition is possible, and we want to make sure that that doesn't happen. So capacity, it's about reliability too. And so this is a little bit less understood for the operation of the electricity system. We hold reserves for operations and for contingencies. In the event that supply demand are different than what we expect, the utilities need to have operating reserves. They have regulation, which is very short time frames. They have load following, which is slightly longer time frames, but just tracking that difference, or tracking supply and demand. We also have contingency reserves. If a transmission line or a generator trips off, you need to have resources that can kick in very quickly. They need to be relatively close to the load or to where the outage occurred to be truly effective. And there are several different types of that capacity. One of the tricks to reserves, though, is that that capacity is sitting there, and until we have appropriate market mechanisms or incentives for that capacity, it isn't getting paid. And so for renewable generators, for example, renewable generators get paid for the energy they produce. If we also want them to be able to provide capacity resources, we need payment mechanisms to make it worth it for them to do that. So now that I have focused on a risk, capacity, I want to talk about one of our big opportunities, and that is electricity markets. As we've discussed, the North American electricity system, the Eastern interconnection is mostly centralized markets. About 2/3 of the load in the United States is served by centralized markets. That is not the case in the West. You can see that big blank spot. That's mostly bilateral markets. We dispatch the system on an hourly basis. It's one utility trading with another, perhaps with a small block of other utilities. It's inefficient, it's slow, and it doesn't match renewable generation that inherently changes within the course of an hour. And so switching to sub-hourly dispatch of the resources, switching to having transmission availability that's more flexible, those are all things that markets can offer. And there are a number of entities in the West. Actually, I think I could fairly say that most of the electricity providers in the West are looking very closely at markets and market expansion and the potential to aid in the energy transition. WAPA is certainly one of those entities. The CAISO Energy Imbalance Market has been a fantastic success. I remember when this was just starting to be a conversation, when NREL was doing analyses of the potential benefits, when both CAISO and SPP were providing proposals to entities in the West on what their energy imbalance services could look like. So that was 2014. 5 years later, we have this market in place. It is covering a very quickly increasing percentage of the Western interconnection. They've picked up some really big electricity providers over the last year and a half. One of WAPA's service territories is joining the EIM, so we're excited about that. It's our Sierra Nevada footprint. We'll be joining with Bank. The benefits, as I looked up, and to see how quickly I can find these, since the implementation of the market, $730 million in savings. Energy imbalance is 5% of the energy that's traded in the electricity markets. So when you start to think of the magnitude of benefits that are available to electricity providers and to consumers as we're able to advance markets, if just 5% can do this, we have a lot of opportunity in front of us. It will be a process to get there. There is an aversion to full markets in the Western interconnection. There are some good reasons for that. One of the things I think that we saw in the East and in SPP in particular is that once they had an energy imbalance market, electricity providers and consumers got more comfortable with the idea of markets and they were able to move to a fully integrated market. Going to SPP, in September, 3 entities signed with the Southwest Power Pool to implement their energy imbalance service in the Western interconnection. It will be along the Front Range. It was WAPA, Tri-State, and Basin Electric that signed those agreements that will be moving forward. We are just at the beginning stages of the implementation. We expect to go live in February of 2021. SPP ran an energy imbalance service in the East for about 7 years. And as I just mentioned, it is what led to the eventual transition to their fully integrated market. Just a second, sorry. All right. So WAPA's regions and markets, as I mentioned at the beginning, WAPA has a 15-state footprint. We've got about 17,000 miles of transmission, the balancing authorities. We've got 4 different regions, and they're all doing different things because our population centers are different, our generation resources are different across the West. That's not just WAPA, that's the entire Western interconnection. Our Desert Southwest region is in the process of looking at EIM and EIS, and we'll make a decision hopefully by early next year about which direction to go on that. Our Rocky Mountain region just joined the Energy Imbalance Service that is going to be being launched by SPP. Our Sierra Nevada region joined to the EIM and will be launching in April of 2021. Our Upper Great Plains region is split across the Western and Eastern interconnection. The Eastern site joined SPP in 2015, about a year after their full market was launched. We did a lot of analytics to evaluate whether that would be beneficial for WAPA. And the administrator of WAPA likes to say that we were 100% wrong in the right direction. That has been a very, very beneficial situation membership for WAPA and for the other entities that joined with us. The SPP market functions extremely well. There is one thing that I've heard a few times over the last couple weeks, so I'd like to shine a little bit more light in this area. There is a criticism of SPP that the system is so coal-dominated, and how is that compatible with the environmental priorities of entities in the Western Interconnection? As Duane mentioned, SPP is hitting renewable penetrations in the 70% range. I pulled their generation for the year. They are still at about 35% coal for generation for 2019. They're at 26% wind, and that's overall. I mean, so they're hitting the 70s, but they're successfully integrating over 25% wind into their generation mix, and they haven't had any reliability issues because of that. It's the big footprint, and it's the market functionality with the sub-hourly. They're also running about 26% gas, and I know that this meeting is discussing gas as a resource, so it's an important one. We need that fast ramp. We need the capacity that that offers. So WAPA energy and balance objectives, I can get that. One of our primary, it's our balancing authorities. We need to keep those stable. We want to help facilitate renewable resources across the West. And we have customers that want to integrate renewable resources, Duane, Tri-State, and we want to be available to help them do that. We want to make sure that that's a reliable transition. Key takeaways: capacity is essential for reliability. I think we have a lot of options to look at for that, but that it's important to keep that in mind, that we have to have the capacity resources as we're moving forward. We can't come back and build them later. We need them now. Well-designed electricity markets are critical. I think we've got some really good ones in place in the West, and that there's opportunities for expansion and improvement. Failure's an option. We need to make sure that we're solving these tough questions now before we get to a point where we are tipping towards a cliff. So with that, I'll wrap it up. And are we taking questions at the end of all of the? All right. Thank you, everyone.
Warning. Chris is well known for lighting fires, and he's assured me that today will be no different.
That's right. The Energy Transition Show aims to really, that's my podcast, you can find it at energytransitionshow.com, aims to really get people focused on what's coming. And so today I'm going to give you my personal opinion of where things are going. I do have some evidence that I'm going to present as well, but this is not going to be the typical academically rigorous stuff that you might expect from my employer, the Rocky Mountain Institute. This is going to be my view of what's happening in energy transition based on my years of studying this. So, do I hit the green button? Yeah, there we go. Here's, I think, a picture that should help to focus our minds a little bit of what's happening in the UK. That top line, that's fossil fuels. The bottom line, that's renewables. They just crossed for the first time ever. Renewables are now generating more electricity in the UK than fossil fuels are. The UK, famous for the phrase, bringing coals to Newcastle, no longer produces coal from Newcastle. And in fact, there are now days, even weeks, when the UK uses no coal power whatsoever. That, to me, is just a remarkable eventuality and something that is really a harbinger of what's to come. Come on now. Oh, okay, there we go. Coal is really fading globally. I know you probably can't really see that chart too well with the detail, but I've circled that red section at the bottom. Those red bars represent coal capacity in the United States. Since about 2010, we've just been losing coal capacity. That's not a surprise to most of you, I'd imagine. But I just want to emphasize the point that that's not just a US phenomenon. When we think about climate change, when we talk about coal capacity in India and China in particular, even that is fading. Those blue bars, that's China. India, those are the purple bars. You can see not an explosion of coal, but a shrinking of coal globally. And that's the reality that we're in. Nothing is going to change that. Nothing's going to reverse that trend. Nothing is going to reverse the trend that I just showed you in the UK either. Just to emphasize that point a little bit, the black line that's rising, that's the capacity of coal that everybody talks about and worries about. But as we've been building coal plants, look what's happened to the capacity factor. That's the blue line. It's crashed. It's down to about 55% in the United States now. According to a recent DOE study, most of the coal plants in the United States that closed over the last couple of years did so during a year after their capacity factors fell to around 50%. There's a lot of the U.S. coal fleet that is now nearing that point. There are a number of U.S. coal plants which were expected to run for at least another decade that have suddenly had their retirement dates moved up because guess what? Their capacity factors are 48%, 50%, 52%. A lot of the U.S. coal fleet is now on the edge. Meanwhile, let's look at what's happening with renewables. This is a typical EIA chart. The renewables are that green line rising from the bottom. And of course, coal is that black line falling from the top. And why, Chris, would you say that renewables are taking over in the U.S. when clearly it's natural gas that has filled in the gap for coal, that rising sort of yellow beige line there? Well, I'll tell you why. Because this is a new report from my colleagues at the Rocky Mountain Institute. You'll be hearing from one of the authors later on, Mark Dyson. Their recent report has showed how clean energy portfolios, represented here by that blue line on the left, have just crossed over essentially with the cost of building and operating new gas plants, and will become cheaper than existing gas plants by, more or less 2033. So gas is also about to flatline. I don't think we're going to build much more gas capacity in this country, and I think that much of the existing gas capacity is going to be increasingly at risk economically and is probably about to follow in the footsteps of coal. Meanwhile, solar and storage is taking over for filling in some of the capacity needs, but also some of the energy needs, and particularly for power conditioning needs, which have often been met in the past, in the recent past, by peaking natural gas plants. So this is just an array of data on recent announcements for solar plus storage PPAs in the western U.S. states. You can see that back in 2015, we were looking at sort of $135 for a kilowatt hour. That's now fallen down to about 40. In the near future, we're looking at prices in the 30s and even below that. So there's a very simple reason for that, and that's that lithium-ion battery costs are just absolutely crashing. So here we've gone all the way from $1,250 per kilowatt hour down to about $157 a kilowatt hour is Bloomberg New Energy Finance's estimate for what it'll be in 2019. They only publish a chart that goes out to 2018, so I kind of had to stuff it in the end there for the 2019 number. But you can see this is a relentless trend. Again, there is nothing that's going to change this. Lithium-ion battery packs, according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance, are actually on track to go to, under $100 a kilowatt hour by 2024. For grid planning purposes, for IRP purposes, that's right around the corner. And when we get under $100 a kilowatt hour for lithium-ion battery packs, I think we're into a whole new game. That really changes the economics of a lot of things. It's going to take some very advanced analytics to figure out how to accommodate that, I think. So again, you have to ask yourself, no matter where you stand, even if you're on the coal side of the ledger, can I see anything that's going to change this? Let's look at vehicle electrification just briefly here. I think that's also inevitable. It's not really about grid power directly, but it is intimately related and will have a significant impact on grid power. What I do at RMI primarily is I worry on vehicle grid integration. How are we going to build the charging infrastructure for electric vehicles? How are we going to integrate those loads onto the power grids in the most beneficial way? How can we use the flexible load of electric vehicles as a demand flexible resource and as a grid balancing resource? And never mind V to G, I'm just talking about G to V, just turning chargers on and off. That's about 90% of the value of vehicle grid integration anyway, is just that, managing it as a flexible load. If we took all light-duty vehicles in this country and we converted them over to electric tomorrow, it would probably increase total electricity load by about 25%. In a world in which utility power growth has been flat or declining for about a decade now, you would think utilities would be all over this opportunity. There is no other load growth opportunity in front of utilities right now as good as the opportunity in electric vehicles. But we still see them lagging in terms of their IRPs, in terms of their proposals to build charging infrastructure, and in terms of their willingness to engage with the electric vehicle sector. One of the biggest problems that I focus on is rate design, because the demand charges on a conventional utility tariff that these high-speed charging stations are on, we're talking 50 to 150 kilowatt or higher charging stations. You know, when the market is young, which is where we are now, if you've got a charging station that's lucky to get a 5% utility utilization rate, you know, they're making $50 a month in revenue and they're getting whacked with $1,500 in demand charges. That's no way to build an industry. So we have to fix that problem. We have to build the charging infrastructure in order to get those vehicles on the road. So this is a big part of what I do at RMI. My standard quip there is that people have often said we have a chicken and egg problem with electric vehicles, that no one will invest billions of dollars in charging infrastructure until there are a lot more vehicles on the road. Nobody's going to go out and buy all those vehicles until we have a lot more public charging infrastructure. And I say we do not have a chicken and egg problem, we have a chicken and waffles problem. The vehicles are definitely coming, so let's stop waffling and build some charging stations. So this is the view right here, I believe, of, this is Bloomberg New Energy Finance again. The top line there, those are the buses. It already makes economic sense every which way you look at it to electrify transit fleets, and they are electrifying rapidly. Right under that, you've got your light commercial, your passenger vehicles, and eventually the medium and heavy. I think they're actually significantly underestimating how quickly the load for medium and heavy is going to arrive, because the economics there are fantastic. So just to really focus our minds on what I'm talking about here in terms of prices, just a quick rundown of a couple of recent announcements, okay? Solar in the US, $19 a megawatt hour. That was 8 Minute Solar Energy's original proposal to LADWP, which eventually turned into a $33 a megawatt hour for solar and storage in LADWP. Across the rest of the country, we're finding all sorts of opportunities for solar plus storage systems. And we're not talking small, we're talking, you know, 700, 800 megawatts, 900 megawatts at under $40 a megawatt hour. Wind plus storage in the US, right here in Colorado, Excel, recent tender, $21 megawatt hour. Solar in Saudi Arabia just recorded $17 a megawatt hour for solar. Offshore wind in the UK, just in its most recent auction in September, hit $50 a megawatt hour for offshore wind. Think about that, offshore wind, the hardest, most expensive part of the stack in renewable generation, for delivery in 2023 to 2024. The government's wholesale reference price right now is $61 a megawatt hour, and under their contracts for difference regime, that means that if they continue going down this way, offshore wind developers are going to have to pay the government the difference between their cheaper resources and their reference price for wholesale power. Think about that. We're not just out of a world in which renewables don't need subsidies anymore. We're now in a world in which renewables are subsidizing everybody else. Offshore wind in the US, most recent bid, $74 a megawatt hour for delivery in 2022, falling to $65 in 2023. That's the Vineyard Wind project. So there's some easy conclusions we can make from this. Number one, coal is dead. It's over. Get out. I'm not even going to start with the stranded assets research. There's tons of it out there. You can go to Carbon Tracker, you can go to whatever. It's plain as day. If we're not at peak gas plant now, we soon will be. We probably don't need any more gas capacity in this country. We can probably use what we've got in as much as we need balancing and dispatchability and firming resources. I don't think the U.S. is ever going to build another nuclear plant, certainly not a conventional Generation 3. If you want to talk about Generation 4, thorium reactors or SMRs or whatever, show me the damn thing when it's built and tell me what it costs on a transparent basis, and until then, I don't care, don't want to hear about it. Renewables will continue to be the new marginal power generation from now on. There's nothing else that can compete with the prices I just showed you, and we don't need any more firming and dispatchable capacity. That's my firm belief. So I'm going to leave you with a couple of hard questions. What synergies will there be between EVs, grid power, buildings, and DERs? This is a whole new emerging field of study. It's very difficult. We really have to figure this stuff out. How are we going to integrate these loads, and how are we going to do it in a way that benefits the ratepayer? What will be the knock-on effects? We're about to take this whole first generation of electric vehicles and retire them or replace their battery packs. The batteries we're taking out of those things still have 80% or so of the capacity in them, which isn't quite good enough for an EV, but it's outstanding to stick it in a building and use it as a stationary battery array for grid power support. Those are going to be cheap, by the way. How will adaptation to climate change and building resilience change energy systems? Talking about wildfires and floods. If you're a subscriber to my podcast, the Energy Transition Show, you will know that back in September, August actually, we actually did a show with Michael Wera, an expert in California, about PG&E's plan to de-energize its transmission lines as a way of dealing with wildfires. So you heard about that a while ago. Whoops, I gotta go back. Long before everybody suddenly woke up and went, whoa, 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 what happened to our grid power here in PG&E land? This was telegraphed a year ago. I don't know why people have been so slow to pick it up. Can wholesale electricity markets adapt to deliver clean power, or will states lead on decarbonizing? I just did a whole trilogy of shows about this. Episode 90 with Pete Fuller, a wholesale power market expert, longtime guy in that world. Episode 97 with Miles Farmer of NRDC, and then episode 105 with Travis Kavula, former regulator in Montana, former head of NARUC, talking about how we're going to use wholesale power markets and state mandates to decarbonize our energy supply. There's some really interesting questions in there that has as much to do with how we reform markets as it does with policy. What happens if we get carbon pricing? What will that do to our procurement of power? And what if we don't? What if we just run on the basis of who's got the cheapest resource right now? What if capacity doesn't actually become something that we value and pay for? What if the whole world moves toward an energy-only market in which the cheapest kilowatt hour, i.e. renewables, dominates? These are not trivial questions. So I want to leave you with this image, and the reason I love it is because this is what happened to Refinery Row in Houston in Hurricane Harvey 2 years ago. It's hard to come up with a more stark visual example of the interface between Mother Nature, climate change, and our fossil-fueled infrastructure. Thank you.
There are a few seats up here for those who want. We're opening this up to questions. I have a bit to go over with the panel, but I'll let you think through your questions. So I'm going to ask the panelists just a couple questions here, and we'll move it off to the audience shortly, okay? And if Black Badger could get the room next door to turn down the volume, that'd be great. Somebody could see to it, Bana. Thank you. So this is a little standard question. What have you learned in the last year that will change your view on power supply planning thinking? Duane, let's start with you.
Can I just ask the question, planning, with the giant question mark?
Yeah.
Planning's gone. The conventional, deterministic, long-term, we build a resource kind of planning. Every 10 years we're going to build another resource. That's done. Yeah. And there's going to be plenty of resource development. I think deterministic, and this may be a pitch to your model, but I mean, deterministic's well out the window, and what we don't want is an optimized plan around one set of assumptions, because we really don't know the future. We got a lot of mystery about the future. What we want is a robust plan rather than an optimum plan, and by robust I mean across a broad range of scenarios, it's pretty good, and that preserves so much flexibility that we can still respond. So long-term investments and long-term resources, be they nuclear or anything else, is a real question. For a utility executive now, we even ask, and the gas question, we see the need for fast start gas as we retire so much coal and build lots of renewable. How do we get through a bomb cyclone week when the sun isn't shining and the wind is blowing too hard? We need something that's dispatchable there, and it might be gas, but can we build it and never get recovery for it? And will it be in the market for a full 20 or 30 years? Probably not. We can't count on 30-year resources anymore. So I think power supply planning has become much more short-term, but also we have to preserve a maximum amount of flexibility in whatever path we choose so that we can have off-ramps and on-ramps.
I like it. I like it, of course.
Of course you do. As a blatant pitch, but one I believe in.
Well, I'll put a little twist on this and make it a little more pointed for you, Rebecca, if you don't mind. So I think, Chris, great presentation. Your podcast, I'm a fan of, and I think a lot of people here are. So it's great to have you up here. And just taking what you said a step further, you did justice. You did light the fires. You said you would. That's why we have the logs up here. I have this notion, it stems from the music industry, and since you're a musician, you'd appreciate this. As a kid, it was first the record player, and then the cassette, then the CD, all inertia devices that generate electricity. And power started with hydro, and then the steam turbine, and then the gas turbine. But as with music, we digitized it with the iPod, and now you get over the internet. The same thing I think is happening with electricity. We're not going to get over the internet, but it's going to be digitized, no more inertia devices. Maybe these old coal steam turbines are going to be like our CD collection and just Christmas ornaments. Question to you is, first, what have you learned in the last year that changed your view on power supply planning? And with that, what are your thoughts about this digitization and the impact on hydro production? Because I see BPA at $38 a megawatt hour struggling, and it's known, and they have a lot of debt. And from WAPA's side, I thought I'd like to hear your perspective as well.
Okay. And so BPA and WAPA, the relationship between those two, we're both power marketing administrations. BPA has a very dense footprint with very large hydro facilities. They've had a lot of water fluctuation. WAPA has a very broad footprint with a much larger number of smaller facilities. We're financed differently. And so anything, in my opinion, what's been sensationalized about BPA's financial position isn't a parallel for WAPA. We're just, although we are sister entities, we're not financed the same. And so I'm speaking as someone who's on the outside of that organization when I talk about their position. I do want to talk about power supply planning, and for WAPA, one of the things that looks at, our hydro assets are fixed. We've got what we've got. Some years we have more than others. Some years we end up buying more power on the wholesale electricity market. One of the things that we're looking at across our system as certain units are being retired, and most of this is coal, is where do you put new generation and how do you partner it? And so solar and storage, I'll use that as a really good example. We've got some entities that are interested in interconnecting to our system. Solar, they're considering storage. They want to see what that does for the interconnection. We have to evaluate what that does for the reliability of our system. And there's an emerging question about where do you put that? Is it perhaps that your firming resource doesn't go with your renewable resource? Would it be better if we put it 300 miles away? Would it be better if we had two smaller systems that were separated from the generation resource? And those are questions that we haven't had to answer before. In many cases, we're not even sure how to start to look at the problem. The entire interconnected system is affected. It's like a spider web, right? You push on one segment of it and it affects everything else. Power flows tend to come out of the northwest and circle around the Front Range down into the southwest and up into California. So as we're making changes, what does that do to our power flows? How do we protect reliability? Where do we put storage? Where do we put solar? How do we start to answer those questions? And that's just power supply planning. That is definitely something that's becoming more acute for us as we're looking at interconnection applications. Now, you specifically asked about hydro resources and the digitization. So WAPA's hydro resources in particular are committed to our customers over very long-term contracts, 30 to 50 years typically. They're very desirable assets because it's a cost-based product. It tends to be significantly cheaper than other wholesale electricity. There's a lot of certainty around it. We're required to deliver a certain amount of energy to our customers. I think that if it were to be opened up to where anybody could buy the hydro from WAPA's system, that they would. And so I think one of the interesting things that could happen with that is that as we're developing markets, as we're advancing the systems, are there potential opportunities for our customers to resell their rights to the hydro assets? And there's some really complex legal questions on that. In terms of digitization, could you tell me a little bit more about what you're looking for on that answer?
Well, it's just a cost competitive dimension. So with music, you can't own a CD store. You go out of business. It's just too cost effective to distribute over the internet. Mm-hmm. And the analog would be in power. It's become a lot more distributed with solar. Now you can have it on your rooftop and be your own generator. And with batteries, that's a digital component as well. And so as technology, as in the music industry, has emerged and changed that, how is technology going to emerge, particularly this digitization component? We've seen this with everything that goes digital, just the costs come down and down through time very low. And even something that we consider a free resource like hydro becomes a little more challenged. And it's the question for BPA, that's not you, we know that, but there is certainly a lot of hydro that's critical, and you have to manage the flow of waters from the mountains to the sea. We all get that. Might as well make some energy out of it. We all get that. But there's some cost to that. And so how do you think that's going to have bearing as we're seeing $20 megawatt hour contracts and hydro costing more than that? Now there's capacity there, but if we looked in the future with digitization, it could be $10 and hydro could be $25, and there's a challenge.
Okay. And so the hydro resources, they're built, they're owned by the federal government, the transmission assets are there. It's a fantastic capacity resource. It's one of the few resources that can provide very effective black start in the event of a widespread outage. As electricity prices go down, as renewables continue to drop in their price points, I think we are going to need that capacity. And one of the points in market design that I think will become an increasing part of the conversation is that we need to be able to compensate asset owners for capacity resources in addition to the generation that they provide. And I want to emphasize again that in talking about capacity, I also mean renewables. Wind and solar can provide that, but it's that opportunity cost. I do not personally believe that we can run a system on pure energy. I think that we have to have other services that are available to maintain the reliability, and that flat out is capacity. We will continue to need those hydro resources. And does that mean, and I'll go to Chris's point, that the rest of the system starts to subsidize certain legacy assets? It's possible. I think it's fairly unlikely, but we'll see. You know, one of the things that rises to my mind as being a potential very significant issue is drought and the uncertainty of what we'll be able to produce from the different hydro facilities from year to year. It tends to be cyclical, and it tends to be, you know, for example, some of our dams are over average and some are significantly under. BPA has had their own issues with up or down on their availability of their own resource, and that can affect the finances too. So I just went outside the scope of your question. I apologize for that, but I wanted to give another plug to the capacity issue. Thank you.
No, it's a present issue, California, and we were just talking to a couple CCAs over lunch, how difficult it is with the capacity shortage and where prices are going. And the most recent update over lunch is higher than we thought, is what I'll say, up to the penalty box, which is, you know, $13 plus a month. So there's real shortages. And we have this kind of intertemporal disequilibrium in this energy market transition. It means we're going to pay a scarcity because we didn't foresee things very well. And scarcity rents are tough, and they can bog down a transition, no doubt. Chris, you have tons of ideas. You've almost answered the question with your presentation, but your thoughts on, you know, particularly the last year. I've listened to your podcast. I've learned a lot from it, and I wondered what you thought was the most you've learned and kind of changed your view in the last year.
I mean, I'll say this. I think the things that have been most surprising to me is how quickly storage plus solar or storage plus wind have become competitive with existing gas over the past year. I really didn't think it was going to happen as quickly as it has. I think also the amazingly rapid price decline for offshore wind. Everywhere, really. I mean, look at Netherlands, look at, you know, Denmark, look at Germany, look at what's happening in the North Sea. I mean, there's this massive project happening in the North Sea now, which will tie together the resources offshore of multiple countries and could become a really significant resource for all of Europe, which is potentially a game changer. If you look at the size of the resource in offshore wind, it's phenomenal. We've just barely started to tap it. The capacity factors are astonishing, you know, 55% and higher. And it's going to be really, really cheap. These new wind turbines that are being deployed are 12 megawatts per turbine. This is just a whole new world. And you know, if you'd asked me a couple years ago how long it would take for offshore wind to become competitive with natural gas, I would have said, I don't know, 2030. You know, I would not have said 2019. I would not have said, you know, before 2020. So to me, that's a really remarkable development. And I just briefly want to address the question you asked Rebecca. I think one of the best ways that we can think about digitalization, especially of power conditioning, is how we use. Oh, it's not working?
Very scratchy.
Oh, all right. Yeah? Good? Okay. Sorry about that. I think one of the best things to do when you're retiring a coal plant, for example, is already being done in a few locations. Take advantage of the fact that you've got the real estate, you've got the transmission line right there, a very difficult to replicate asset and also a very valuable one, and just put in a solar plant if you've got the solar resource there. Put in a wind plant nearby if you've got a wind resource nearby, and use that existing capacity. I mean, we can stop using all these coal plants for power generation and just start using them as synchronous generators, or condensers rather, to do power conditioning across the grid, in addition to all the ways of doing digital inertia. So I think that's something that we should be thinking about.
All right. Well, thanks. Recognizing time and all, I know a lot of you have questions to ask, so I won't hog the panel anymore. We'll open up the floor. Anybody have any questions for the panel?
Stunned them into silence, I think.
I have a question for Chris. I'm Ben Fischfleisch with Northwestern Energy, and you claim pretty clearly that we don't need any new gas capacity. I'm curious if that's based largely on the price projections you said, or also on reliability studies and whatnot. I know we count ourselves in the Pacific Northwest, and E3 just came out with a pretty compelling study that shows the cheapest way to reduce emissions is to build a lot more gas. Low capacity factor, but we need it, and that's what our studies are showing. So you're calling them liars, or maybe not so strongly? Could you elaborate?
Well, once again, I'm giving you my personal opinion. I do read the research. I have not read the research that you're referring to right now. I am familiar with how you do a study like that. And I know that it really depends on the assumptions you plug into that study in terms of what kind of result you get out of it. If your study says that the best way to maintain reliable power going forward is with gas, then I'm going to have to ask you what your assumptions were about the cost and availability of wind and solar, especially ones equipped with storage. And without even looking, I'm going to bet that that's based on data that you might get from, let's say, Lazard, which currently shows prices for those resources at about 2x what the current PPAs are, because it's backward-looking data, and it's not looking forward to what PPA prices are now. So it really depends on how you construct the study as to what result you come out with. But just in terms of my view that we don't need more capacity, I don't think there has been yet done a study that's adequately robust to really show what I'm talking about. I don't think that study's been done. But I do think that the mere fact that load growth has been flat for a decade now, and in many organized markets, we've had reserve margins creeping up, even as we're putting more load onto the electricity system. We're taking it out of combustion and putting it onto the grid, and yet load remains flat or declining. Really should get our attention and should make us think about what happens when we put a whole lot more storage enabled wind and solar onto the grid. What happens when we have more distributed wind and solar, and especially distributed solar? I mean, look, what is the right answer for California right now other than de-energizing its transmission lines when wildfire risk is high and plunging Northern California into the dark? The right answer is distributed storage and rooftop systems and microgrids, right? And if you don't think that that's going to happen like a wildfire in terms of how quickly it sweeps across the state in the next couple of years, you're just not paying attention. So if you can imagine that kind of thing happening, then you re-ask yourself, well, how much new capacity do I need from gas, from centralized plants, to provide reliability, to provide grid conditioning? The answer is not much.
Yeah, go for it.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for the question. I'd like to respond to that also. And the study that, and I'm sorry, I forgot your name, but the gentleman from Northwestern is referring to was recently presented at a Northwest Power Pool symposium on resource adequacy. It was prepared primarily by E3, which is a consulting organization that is very, very supportive of renewables. And so we would say on that if there is a benefit of the doubt to be given in terms of the cost for renewables, that they're doing it. One of the things that's happening in the Pacific Northwest is that there is typically a lot of wholesale trading activity. There are a lot of resources that are coming offline, primarily coal resources. This is good news. We like this, right? But they're coming offline before the expansion of the renewable resources is strong enough to support it. And what the Northwest is seeing is that there are potential capacity shortages in their operations, potentially very significant across a portion of the country that is very dense. They've got a lot of hydro, but what if the hydro production is low on that. And so, Chris, I hear your point very clearly about the costs and the availability, and do we really, on paper, if we're averaging it out over the period of a year, do we need new generation? Yeah. Do we need it for reliability, though? Yes. We absolutely have to have dispatchable capacity, and again, that can at some point be renewable resources, but to protect the reliability of the system. For me personally, and I think I mentioned I went to CU, my background is in environmental studies. I really want to see us get to very high penetrations of renewable resources, but we can't crash the system in the process, nor can we crash the markets. The energy crisis in 2000 stopped the West from advancing markets for almost 20 years. If we have a large-scale outage that can be blamed on renewables, we're going to have a problem with additional expansion. And so my personal perspective on that is that I'd like to see us build some more gas and make sure that we've got enough dispatchable capacity to get us over the bridge, because we will not get another chance like this to continue to expand renewables if we create a significant reliability or market issue in the process.
Yeah, Duane,
Can I jump in too?
please.
So-
Before you go, just one last thing, just following up on Rebecca's comment. We're all been around a while here, and so we remember kind of in the early 90s, DSM got a black eye because it promised a lot and failed to deliver. And, as you answer your question, if you could opine on that a little too.
Overpromise, underdeliver.
Yeah, with respect to, hey, we have this reliability. Can we take this leap? What's the most economic way? We know what's tried and true.
So let's try a really wacky leap. When we talk about solar plus storage, wind plus storage, the price of battery storage is linear with the number of hours of storage you're buying. And 2 hours of storage, which is economical today, or even 4 hours against a utility demand charge is economical, but 24 hours of storage is not today. And even at 20% per year reduction in battery costs, that eventually flattens out because batteries don't get to free. And you just need the ability to have about a week's worth of storage to get through a bomb cyclone event. And what do we have that can replace the reliability of a coal stockpile or a gas pipeline in that event? And what I'd offer is this: maybe it's ammonia. Now, that sounds completely wacky, but it's a totally non-carbon fuel cycle. And if we're going to meet our energy penetration goals of renewables, we're likely to overbuild solar during the daytime. And so we'll see LNP prices, once we have a market, going to zero or even negative, a great incentive for electrolysis for the production of hydrogen. Now, people talk about hydrogen economy all the time, but the storage and movement of hydrogen efficiently isn't real good. In fact, if you convert that hydrogen to ammonia by running an air separation unit and pulling nitrogen out of the air, you can make ammonia and you can transport more hydrogen in a tanker of ammonia than you can in a tanker of hydrogen because of the density of the molecules. And that can be stored in a 1 million-gallon storage tank and burned in an internal combustion engine. So now we have the substitute for a coal stockpile or for a gas pipeline. And in a totally non-carbon fuel cycle, when you crack that hydrogen and oxidize that ammonia, you get water vapor and nitrogen, and then you can go do the whole cycle again.
Yeah, I see this is a key for the energy transition. Chris, you talked about it in one of your podcasts. It was a study of all of Europe. And they talked effectively, in order to get from 80 to 100% in particular, that last 20%, clearly we're going to have a lot of renewables, frankly a lot of dump energy. Doing something with that, like making ammonia, it makes a lot of sense, particularly in the spring and the fall where there's surplus, you don't know what to do with it. Hey, let's make ammonia and let's use these resources we have, maybe some new flexible resources as well. When we did the resource plan for Hawaii, they're the first to go 100% renewable. It had been rejected a couple times before we stepped in. And what we found was the most economic thing to do first, because they had all this steam generation that was really old, is to put in some internal combustion engines, flexibly track and move and they're quite islanded. And I couldn't resist. And they don't have any ability to interact. So when a storm comes through, particularly in the winter months, where their load is actually low, that's when they need some backup. And so it's a mixture. When we say 100% renewable, it's 100% to serve load. So typically there's 10% there that's burning gas. And I don't think anybody here is terribly concerned about that last few percent and doing something uneconomic and irrational. But today, you're making large capital, almost irreversible investments. And with that irreversible investment, you don't want it to become a stranded cost. And there's enough of that out there. And it poses a conundrum. What do we do? You know you're going to be able to use this. You're going to have a need for it in the future. And so it's a matter of a portfolio. We all know that. An array of assets that will meet the needs, as I see it. So I have to open this up to the audience. Any more questions?
I just wanted a little bit of disaggregation of energy and capacity, because it sounds like the two are being conflated in the previous statements, that we were bringing on new gas to serve capacity needs when, if I'm not mistaken, there was not necessarily a new production need, new total generation requirements. The reason I'm asking is obviously for standalone storage, battery storage, or other forms of storage assets being brought online very quickly, more quickly than new renewable resources for generation, to serve short-term or short-ish term capacity needs. Is that something that has been thought of by WAPA and elsewhere as well? I know we have examples of distressed procurements serving that need in California, but I'm curious if other people have thought about that.
Reference to WAPA, we can talk about that. And so gas generation in particular, it ramps very quickly, and it can be super responsive to changes in output from other generators. And so in this part of the country in particular, if we have icing events for wind, if we have overspeed, if something happens to a big transmission line, we have some very big wind farms. If something goes off, we can spin gas up very quickly, and it can sustain for as long as we need it to. Batteries, I think, as they evolve and we get more of them on the system, will be able to perform a similar function because they are incredibly fast acting, can replace other generation very quickly. The trick on that is that they can't sustain as long. And so what happens when you've got that, you pulled all the energy that you can out of that battery and you still don't have something else to back it up. As we get more out there, I think that will be a solution. I don't think we're there yet. And I think that we've got a gap right now between where we are today, where we're going. We have to have a bridge to get there, and I'm not sure that we have a complete plan in place for what that bridge will look like. Does that help on the battery to gas?
Yeah, I guess it's still it seems like a siloed view if you're also kind of trying to emphasize the position for markets to play fill those needs over time as well.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a long duration need, you have a market respond to that.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to say like this resource goes down, so I need one exact resource to replace it, right?
Yeah. And I completely agree. I think markets will make an incredible difference. We have not, since the early 2000s, CAISO, California has the RTO within its own state, and that's been incredibly effective and efficient, and it's a great system. The energy imbalance market has been able to expand. We just brought the EIS into the West, but in terms of a full RTO across the Western interconnection, we haven't been able to get that moving yet. And I think that will be a very critical piece where you do have additional resources, where you have a very large operating footprint where you can do different types of unit commitment, that will make a big difference. If I had a magic wand, that's what I would use it for, is to get a market across the West, but I don't, so sorry. Okay.
I'll help you waive it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does anybody else want to chime in on that?
Actually, I do have a comment.
You said there was understandable reasons for resistance in the West. What are those?
To markets? Okay. A lot of it does have to do with the California energy crisis and Enron. There is a big distrust of markets, and so that's an issue. And then a completely separate issue is that the Western interconnection has a lot of long-haul transmission. We have a lot of balancing authorities. We have a lot of different system operators who own significant assets, billions of dollars of investment in assets. And when you create a market And Tri-State and WAPA were both involved in the Mountain West Transmission Group, which unfortunately we got close, but we didn't quite get there. But creating equity for the entities that are turning their assets over to the market is very, very difficult, especially when you have a big dispersed system. And so I can speak for WAPA and for Tri-State. We have very long haul transmission that's very desirable to entities like Excel, for example, that has a very dense operating footprint. How do you compensate the transmission owners for what they've already got on the ground that will provide big benefit to the entities that have that are the load serving entities? And so a lot of that is the cost allocation and the benefit allocation, and it's just tricky. And it is the fact that the West is so balkanized. We have 38 different control areas. How do you start to bring all of those together? It's just hard. And then you're going across state lines too, so you've got lots of jurisdictional issues.
And each state wants a piece of the action to dictate how it happens in their state. So then the utility regulatory commissions get involved, and they get nervous about loss of control and loss of authority. And is the market going to dictate certain transmission in certain places and they'd rather see it somewhere else, or certain resources in certain places, or is the market actually going to run some other state's resources more than your state's resources? And that becomes a very, I'm not saying that's a legitimate criticism, it's an illegitimate criticism, but it's one that occurs because of the regulatory environment.
Chris, you just did an energy transition show almost on this.
Yeah, indeed. Is the mic? Yeah, okay. I guess one of the problems here is that you do want to have an idea, or at least a visibility to a plan of how you get from here to there, as Rebecca was just saying. One of the biggest problems with energy transition is you don't actually have the data to know what's happening. One of the hallmarks of energy transition is you're moving from a hub and spoke world of power generation and distribution to one which is massively distributed. You're taking out the hubs, and everything is happening at the edges. So when we retire a coal plant, everybody knows it. The EIA tracks every single plant and can tell you exactly when it's going to retire, can tell you how much capacity will be lost or whatever. We don't know right now, and you couldn't even find out if you wanted to, where the EVs are, where the distributed solar equipped with storage systems are at people's houses. That data is not tracked. When somebody makes an efficiency investment in a building that radically reduces the load of that building, there's no way to track that. So what's happening is energy transition is happening all around you, but the data is not being presented or exposed in a way that anybody can track it. It very well may be that you shut a coal plant down, and over the period of a couple years before and after it, there's enough happening elsewhere in the grid to compensate for that loss. But no one can count it, and no one can report it. So that's one of the really key problems here with even having visibility. You know, I've heard the argument, especially made by nuclear proponents, that we need to know how we're going to close that gap between an 80% renewable system and a 100% renewable system 30 years from now, and we have to know that answer right now. And I asked them why. Why do you have to know what the answer to that is now, especially since you know for sure that there will be a lot of innovation that happens over the next 30 years, that the solution set 20 years from now is not going to be the same solution set available to you today. That the prices are going to be totally different. In fact, they're going to be completely unpredictable to you today. So why do you need to know what that answer is right now? Well, their answer is because they need 30 years to get the policy in place and to get the damn nuclear plants built. But if you take that off the table and you allow for the fact that we're going to work our way toward that outcome in a stepwise fashion, and we're going to have to drive within the range of our headlights and no faster, that really changes the calculus. Maybe you can't make a plan to get from here to there. Maybe you don't have the data, you don't have the visibility, and furthermore, you never will. All you can do is roll with the changes, to quote REO Speedwagon.
All right, we have time for one more question.
Hi, I'm Jeff Lerner from Vizsla. This is actually a great segue into my question.
You had a question about REO Speedwagon?
But no, it's very interesting because we're bringing up these problems that somewhat unique to the West about capacity coming offline, like in the Northwest, transmission being built out too slow. And so will rapid increase in the small scale distributed energy be the answer to address some of these issues? And even if we don't have the data, do we see this like happening in the short term without a huge change, I guess, politically or incentive-wise? What are your takes on that? I'd like to know.
I would like to offer just an economics opportunity here. So the small scale stuff is great and it serves a need in certain areas, but there's still an enormous cost advantage for utility scale. And I wouldn't have thought it to be so pronounced. We were in the solar development business before I came out here. One of the companies I ran had a solar development subsidiary, but there's definitely a very strong trend. If you're looking at a 2 to 5 megawatt system, 4.5 cents a kilowatt hour. But if you're looking at a 100 megawatt system, we can beat your numbers. Below 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour today. So even better. And so there is a cause to be made for some of that centralized stuff. And yet the grid in the West is just really so skinny compared to what we've got. A little bit of load and lots of miles. And it's just not the tightly interconnected transmission system that the Eastern grid enjoys. And so that means congestion has to be considered a lot. And a regional market would bring a lot to bear in this in terms of helping identify opportunities. But as you said, the timeline for construction, if we're talking about 15 years, it's not going to help us make that transition. So we're prioritizing utility scale plants that can be integrated at maybe not the best locations for solar production or the best locations for wind, but you don't have to build much transmission, so the development risk of getting that done in time is low. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no,
yeah.
Thank you. And adding to that, I think, is my mic still working?
Oh.
Yeah, okay. And so for just small distributed generation, and I think a lot of that, the behind the meter is solar, right? And so we do still need power at night. Residential applications, a lot of that I think we'll be able to supplement with storage. So you have solar during the day, you have storage at night. When you start to look at big industrial applications, if you start to look at downtown areas, we can't, I don't believe, support that with distributed solar. We need utility scale renewables too. And that will be large scale wind and large scale solar. And geothermal, and there are actually a host of other resources that could potentially come to the table if and when we have markets that can appropriately incentivize them. But you do need that bulk electric system to support smaller scale generation too. You can't just run it on smaller. And in my opinion, and I am open to, I know that there are probably people in this room who don't agree with that opinion, and so I want to really make sure that I own that. But and I think we need a healthy bulk electric system to have healthy distributed generation that can provide a very substantial portion of our energy needs. And then you have to have the money that flows to that. One of the criticisms that we hear pretty frequently is standby charges. How is that equitable to where an entity has to pay a standby charge to pay for a grid that they're not using? Well, you do need that grid sometimes. And so how do you start to funnel the money in ways that's fair to everybody but keeps the entire system healthy? And it's tricky.
I guess I see, I don't know if this answers your question, but I see a lot of new technologies coming to the fore in the next couple of decades that aren't things we're thinking about right now, that we're not really even talking about right now. One of the things that I keep coming back to is that, when you confront this question of, well, what about when those windless winter weeks, which was the title of a Navigant report recently, where they looked at what does Europe do? When you're way up there in the northern hemisphere, it gets really cold in the winter. What happens during those weeks when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, and now you're on a heavy renewables grid, and nobody really thinks that the gap is all going to be made up with batteries, right? I think about all the other storage technologies that are not on the table. I think about what is the real need for grid power during those times? Well, a lot of it is needed for heat, space heating. And in fact, there's a massive untapped opportunity for low-grade, low-temperature heat, just thermal storage. things like utes, right? Underground thermal energy storage. It's basically an unexploited, untested resource. It's absolutely massive, and it's all over the world. Heat pumps are another potential solution. And in fact, with a residential setting where you've got a small rooftop, even in Europe, where you've got a small rooftop solar system and a small distributed battery, that battery has enough power to run an air source heat pump for quite a while, right? And so rather than thinking about things in terms of big chunks, like we're going to take out this big chunk and we're going to replace it with this other big chunk, think instead, we're going to take out this big chunk and we're going to replace it with 1,000 little things. And I think that's probably what's really going to happen. I don't know if that answers your question. Okay.
That was great. I guess I've spent our time here, but well. Thank you all very much. It's been fantastic hearing your insights. And I think we're on to the next panel of market mavens.
Thank you. Thank you.